You remember Deng Xiaoping? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rancor. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm one of your co-hosts, Henry Hakamaki, unfortunately not joined by my other co-host, Professor Adnan Hussain, who of course is a historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. I am fortunately joined by a returning guest host who will be very familiar to listeners of Guerrilla History, Brett O'Shea, who, of course, is host of Revolutionary Left Radio and the Red Menace podcast, as well as former co-host of this podcast. Hello, Brett. It's nice to see you again.
Hello. Yeah, very nice to be here, as always.
Of course. We are continuing our mini-series today, but before I remind the listeners of the mini-series and introduce our wonderful guest, I would like to remind listeners that they can help support the show and allow us to continue making episodes like this by going to patreon.com/Guerrilla History. That's GUERRILLA History. And you can follow us on Twitter to keep up with everything that we're putting out individually and collectively at Guerrilla_pod. That's GUERRILLA_pod. As mentioned earlier, this is a continuation of a mini-series, and specifically our mini-series on the history of modern China, featuring the one and only Ken Hammond. Hello, Ken. It's nice to have you back on the show.
Glad to be back again. We're going to have a good way to wrap up our series today.
Absolutely. So to remind the listeners, Ken is professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University and is author of the book China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. As Ken mentioned, this is the conclusion of our mini-series on modern Chinese history. This is part 4. So listeners, if you are tuning in now and you haven't heard the rest of the series yet, I highly recommend that you go back and check that out now. We had a preambulatory episode back in September on China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. That was before we knew we were going to be doing this as a mini-series. And then we had the first 3 parts of the series on the Taiping and Boxer rebellions, the Chinese Civil War and Revolution. And last time we talked about the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, kind of both parts of that in that conversation. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about the Deng Reform period. So before we get into the actual conversation here, I just want to let everyone know that yes, this period is rather controversial. There's going to be very strong opinions in both ways. We want to let you know as we get into this that we're not going to be telling you that one ideological position is the correct position. We have faith in you in being able to synthesize information, and this is meant to provide that sort of information to you so that you are well equipped to synthesize all that we're providing with for you, and then make principled ideological decisions on your own. We're not here to tell you that we're the arbiters of what's right and what's wrong, but simply that we're here to give you that nice information in a way that hopefully is useful to you. So, Ken, picking up where we left off last time, we left off with the death of Mao, and you had just started to introduce who the Gang of Four were. So perhaps you can touch on what the kind of geopolitical context of Mao's death was, because it was a very interesting time in Chinese history. A lot of things were changing right at the time when Mao died. You mentioned that year was kind of a tragic year for China in many ways. And then can you let us know about the case of the Gang of Four, because that was really where we left off last time?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're quite right. 1976 was a tough year for China, for the Chinese people. Not so much in the sense of economic setbacks or anything like that, but it was a year where 3 of the leading figures in the revolution, 3 individuals who had been in the party since the 1920s, had led revolutionary struggles, had been responsible for the founding and the development of the Red Army, all passed away. Zhou Enlai, who had been the prime minister and back in the 1950s had been foreign minister of the People's Republic, dies in January. Zhu De, who was the founder of the Red Army, dies in July. And Mao Zedong, of course, the chairman of the party, the leader of the revolutionary struggle in many ways, dies on September 9th of 1976. In the midst of all that, in late July, there's the Tangshan earthquake, which was a huge, devastating earthquake, killed several 100,000 people. Tangshan is a little distance northeast of Beijing. Tremors were felt all the way in the capital. This was a very, very big event, very devastating, and taken by many people as indicative, within sort of Chinese traditional cultural cosmological ideas, that great changes were underway. That the country was in a sort of moment of crisis, and something had to give. So that sets the stage for a period, a couple of years of struggle, of efforts within the party to sort of learn from the experience of the first 3 decades of building socialism in China, and reassess the situation and decide how to go forward from that point. And critical in that was the struggle against what was called the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four were 4 individuals: Jiang Qing, who was Chairman Mao's wife, Yao Wenyuan, and Zhang Chunchao, who were longtime party sort of ideological activists, and Wang Hongwen, who was one of the workers down in Shanghai back in 1967, who had become a leader in the Shanghai Commune that we talked about last time. And these 4 had sort of constituted a focal point, a political position in the struggles within the party in the 1970s. They were very focused on issues of the superstructure, the ways in which the dialectic between the base and the superstructure play out, the ways in which old ideas, if you will, hearkening back to some of the things we talked about with the Cultural Revolution, needed to be revolutionized, needed to be overthrown. So they constituted what we might think of as a strong left position within the party. And they were in tension with, in conflict with, many times, what is often referred to as the more pragmatist or the more, down-to-earth side of the struggles within the party. Those people who argued that what was necessary in building socialism was to concentrate on the economic base, concentrate on technological and scientific development, and concentrate on the tasks of building a new economy, which were complex and challenging and required the party and the people to really work together in ways that would be constructive and building up the economic foundation for a future of greater prosperity. And that grouping was sort of centered around Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping, who had been closely associated with Liu Shaoqi, who of course had assumed the presidency when Mao stepped down after the Lushan plenum back in 1959. Liu Shaoqi died in the course of, he had a severe illness and died in 1969 in the midst of the sort of turmoil of the Cultural Revolution. But Deng Xiaoping, who had been, sidelined during the CR, is brought back to sort of oversee what were called the 4 modernizations in science and technology and things like that. Then he's purged again, brought back again, and given positions of responsibility by Chairman Mao. But then in the spring of 76, after Zhou Enlai's death, when there's a popular movement in April at what's called the Qingming Festival, the sort of Day of the Dead kind of festival that they have in China. Many people in Beijing assembled at Tiananmen Square to place wreaths and banners and things honoring Zhou Enlai. that was seen by the Gang of Four as endorsing, their people who had the opposite political position that they were holding. And at that time, Chairman Mao was already so ill that he was not really kind of managing day-to-day affairs. And so the Gang of Four characterized the April 5th demonstrations as a anti-party movement. And they associated Deng Xiaoping with that, so he was out once again. So he had this very up and down kind of roller coaster career in the 70s. After the death of Chairman Mao, September 9th, there's a very rapid consolidation of the more pragmatist wing in the party, and there's a consensus emerges that they want to move away from these very militant positions that were held by the Gang of Four. And so in early October, just about a month after Chairman Mao dies, Chairman Mao's what's called the bodyguard unit of the PLA, they move to arrest the Gang of Four, and they are held in prison. They're eventually put on trial, and that's all a very public and open event. I remember watching parts of it on CCTV. That leads to prison sentences for them, although none of them serves out their full term in prison. They all get released at one point or another as we move deeper into the reform period. But they are removed from positions of influence, and that doesn't, though, immediately resolve the internal questions. There are still distinct positions about how to go forward. There's a feeling within the party, and I think on the part of many people, that the Cultural Revolution had been, on the one hand, had been successful in awakening within the party the recognition of the need for closer integration, the recognition, the sort of re-engagement with the perspective that, the party is the instrument of the masses. The masses are not there to carry out the party's will. The party is there to manifest and fulfill the wishes, the desires, the needs of the people. And a lot of people felt that, but they also felt that the mass political campaigns, the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, which Chairman Mao, of course, had characterized as great chaos under heaven, situation excellent, had done its part, had played itself out, and in many ways had been a very difficult period, a period in which, many errors, many mistakes were also made, and it was time for a new orientation. But exactly what that new orientation was going to be took a couple of years to hammer out. It's not until the end of 1978 that a new direction, a consensus about a new direction emerges. And even then, as we'll talk about going forward today, there's not a uniform approach. It's not that everyone totally agrees about every point in the reform program or how to implement reforms, but there comes to be a consensus, a broad enough consensus that significant changes are needed. And so by the end of 78 and going forward from then, for one thing, Deng Xiaoping reemerges, comes back into public view. He doesn't assume the position of chairman of the party. He doesn't become president of the country. He becomes a vice premier, so a sort of second tier position in the central leadership. But he does become what's called general secretary of the party. Although he doesn't hold that position, permanently. Deng Xiaoping doesn't want to position himself at that point in the same kind of central leadership role within the institutions of the party and the state that a figure like Chairman Mao had held. Which doesn't mean that we don't recognize that Deng Xiaoping was actually the driving sort of the center, the force that was leading the reform movement. But again, as we've talked about with Chairman Mao, Deng Xiaoping isn't the reform movement. He's a critical leader, but these political positions are held. broadly within the party, and certainly in the government of the PRC and amongst the people of the country, a commitment to a new orientation, a new drive forward in this process, the ongoing process of trying to build a socialist economy and a new economy and society for China.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I have two questions for you, one personal and one historical. If you don't want to answer the personal one, we can cut this out. It's just a curiosity of mine. You said that you were alive and present and watching the trials of the Gang of Four. I'm wondering, at that time in your life, did you have any particular sympathies one way or the other, or were you just sort of a neutral observer? That's the personal question. And then the political question is, before we get into the reform era, if you could say a little bit about Deng Xiaoping's sort of involvement in the Communist Party through these events we've already covered in the previous series, before Mao sort of lost coherency, and then his life, what their relationship was. I know you said it was rocky, up and down, but if you could talk a little bit, what was Deng's involvement, if any, in these incidences, like the Long March, like the Cultural Revolution, etc. So that would be the historical question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, personally, this was a period of transition. I became concerned with China, interested in China when I was in high school in the mid 1960s, and of course that was when the Cultural Revolution was ramping up. It was also when the United States was deeply engaged in its imperialist war in Vietnam. So that was the moment in which I was becoming politically active and reading everything from classical Marxist literature to studies of what was happening in places like Indonesia and Vietnam and China. So my initial sort of political formation was strongly influenced by the Cultural Revolution, by reading Chairman Mao and all that. So, when the change takes place, after Mao's death, and then the purging of the Gang of Four, and then the enunciation of the reform program, to be perfectly frank, my initial reaction was that this was, in fact, what Chairman Mao had feared, and was, China sort of taking the capitalist road. And I think that perception was widespread among many of us who had been active. I had been in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and people came out of that after that sort of self-destructed at the end of 1969, end of 69. Many of us were a little perplexed about going forward and what was happening in China. We had already been shocked by Nixon's going to China and all that. So now this just, for a while, this really seemed to me to be a bad turn, a turn in a bad direction. And it took a while. I fortunately I moved to China in 1982 and lived there for the next 5 years, and so I was there through the real beginning of the reform era. And when I arrived in Beijing in the summer of '82, it was still, it was just coming out of the way that society had been for the previous basically 30 plus years. It was still a sort of blue and gray kind of environment. And in terms of, people's clothing and things like that, and the streets, and Beijing is a very gray city historically, because a lot of the walls in the hutongs and the streets in the neighborhoods were painted gray. So it's an image that's very, very strong in my mind from my first years there. But it changed very quickly, and many of those changes were clearly felt to be good by the people that I was getting to know. And as I was studying, learning Chinese, working there, traveling around, not just in Beijing, but I traveled all over the country, because the work I was doing involved being a sort of advanced person for American educational delegations, helping to make their domestic arrangements within the country. So I saw a lot of China in the 80s, and we can talk about the reforms and their policies and their impacts and all that, but what I saw, my own experience, showed me that this was actually improving the lives of hundreds of millions of people, and that my own concerns and my perceptions of it transformed, and I came to hold views which I continue to of the reform project as a great enterprise, a great endeavor, a great experiment, but one which was fraught with dangers, and which had to be managed and carried out in a very cautious and careful way. As history has unfolded, it's been 42 years since I first went to China. I've seen that. For me, my perception is that I've seen that take place, that I've seen the party lead this process, and I've seen the people participate in this process in ways which, to me, suggest that this has been a worthy endeavor, and one which certainly hasn't been 100%, miraculously successful in creating a perfect worker state where everybody's, joyous 24/7, but is a project that remains, in progress and worthy of the political, and to whatever extent we can do, material support of people around the world. And I think largely receives that from lots of folks. So that's kind of my personal view, that I was very skeptical and cautious to begin with, but the realities as I have seen them and studied them over these years indicates to me, as I discuss, I talk about this, of course, in the book on China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future, that the reforms have been a good thing and continue to be pursued in basically positive ways. Certainly there continue to be contradictions and challenges, and we can talk about those. But that's my bottom line kind of assessment. As far as Deng Xiaoping's historical position, Deng is a very interesting figure. He was one of the younger of the leaders. He was born 1904, I believe it was. So 12 years or so after Chairman Mao. And 6 years or so after Zhou Enlai, and so he was on the younger side during the World War I era. He lied about his age and was able to sign up for one of the labor volunteer groups that went to France, and he worked for a while in the Renault factory, the auto factory outside of Paris, which was a hotbed of the French Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping, along with Zhou Enlai, who was there not on the same program but was also in France at that time, became members of the French Communist Party, and then were in 1921 in the group that founded the European sort of branch of the Communist Party of China, in tandem with the foundational meetings of the CPC in Shanghai and Hangzhou at that time. He stayed in France for a while. He spent time in Russia. Comes back to China, and is involved in the party's work in urban China. He doesn't take part in the Long March, but he does go to Yan'an and becomes a very important figure. Like most of the leading comrades, he plays both a civil and a military role in the party. He doesn't become one of the top leaders right away, but he is very much involved, especially in the Red Army and the liberation struggle. After liberation, he in the 50s, the early 50s, he's stationed in the Southwest. He was from Sichuan province to begin with, and interestingly, he was also from the Hakka ethnic community that we talked about as being really a basic the sort of base of the Taiping Rebellion all the way back in the 1840s and 50s. He's based in the Southwest. China, for the first few years, was divided into what they called military regions, and so he's in the leadership of the Southwest military region. But then as they moved to the more stable state formation and all that, he's involved in the leadership, but at a very much at a second tier kind of level. on this sort of more pragmatist side. He was a supporter of the Great Leap Forward. In retrospect, the Great Leap is often viewed with a rather jaundiced eye in China by the present leadership. But Deng Xiaoping himself, if you read his speeches and his writings in the late 50s, was certainly a supporter of agricultural collectivization. And a supporter of the Great Leap, although he also, takes a very pragmatic approach to resolving those contradictions. We talked about some of the policies and changes that took place after the Lushan Plenum, after the 10,000 cadre conference in 1961. Deng is right in there, focusing on economic policy and all that. And the Cultural Revolution, of course, because of his association, he was very closely associated with Liu Shaoqi. And Deng Xiaoping was targeted as one of the leading figures, on the conservative side of the Cultural Revolution. So Deng Xiaoping spends a lot of time away from Beijing, down south. He's actually comes to be. He resides on a military base outside of Guangzhou or Canton, as it's known in the West. And that goes on until this sort of up and down period for his career in the 70s. He's always associated, as I say, with this sort of there's this dichotomy that gets talked about sometimes in the first 30 years of the revolutionary government between the Reds and the experts, and he always leans to the expert side in the sense of viewing the challenges of development as things which required people with particular talents, skills, experiences, expertise. So he definitely occupies a very distinctive position about how socialist development should go forward. But there's no question that, he was a deeply devoted communist revolutionary, deeply devoted to the goal of socialist development, the goal of building a new socialist China. But the policy orientation, the positions that he occupied, were often in contrast to those that Chairman Mao and his followers strongly endorsed. So that's just characteristic of this sort of struggle between two lines. By the time we get down to the end of the 70s, and with his reemergence in November and December of 1978. Many people in the party have come to share his perspective. Not in a monolithic kind of way. I want to really always emphasize that, and we'll talk about that when we look at some of the debates in the 80s and beyond. The reform orientation is itself a broad field, and there are distinctive positions within it which we can tease out as we go forward. But there is a strong consensus supporting Deng Xiaoping and the ideas which he is raising and propagating from 1978 going forward.
Well, to hop in here, I'm going to ask a two-part question as well, although my two parts are going to kind of feed into each other. So, whether it's one expansive question or two related questions is up for debate. The first question is about periodization of the reforms. And this is maybe something that we shouldn't dwell on too long, kind of a minute point, but just something I'm particularly interested in. So as we look at this reform period, I've seen it periodized in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that I've seen it periodized is from 1978 up to 1984 as a first phase, the lifting of price controls in 1985 to Tiananmen in 1989 is a second phase from Tiananmen to the Southern Tour. So 1989 to 1992 is kind of a third phase. And then from 1992, the Southern Tour up until joining the World Trade Organization being a separate phase. I know that I'm throwing out a lot of dates, listeners. I apologize, but Ken will clear it up for me. And then the other way that I saw it characterized or broken down is they took a much broader first wave in terms of from 1978 basically up to Tiananmen as kind of there was undulations, but it basically was the same phase. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 up through joining the WTO in 2001 with, again, undulations as we went, but again, falling within the same phase. And then from joining the WTO in, if I remember correctly, 2001 onwards. So those aren't like super different, but I'm just kind of interested in what you would say is a more useful way to look at the periodization, because it'll definitely help me think about it. And I think it'll probably also help listeners think about how to view these different periods, because regardless, I think that there is a general consensus that it's more useful to look at the reform period as phases of reform rather than one continuous program that flowed from beginning to end. And then relatedly, regardless of whether you go with the really small breakdown in terms of small numbers of years and ending up with a bunch of phases, or the second characterization of a little bit bigger periods of time and a smaller number of phases, the early days in both would generally be considered to be within one phase. And I guess if we could start talking about some of the reform measures, decollectivization of agriculture, allowing of foreign investment, entrepreneurship, things like that, up to the lifting of price controls, because in both cases, that would be considered the first wave. It's just in one of the characterizations, the lifting of price controls would also be considered to be part of a first wave. Sorry that's like a very convoluted question, Ken. Hopefully you can make something out of it.
Well, you lay out quite clearly a lot of the discussions and the debates that go on with people engaged in this. I think it's okay to think of it in a couple of different ways. We can maintain a sort of, whether you want to turn up the fine tuning, or whether you just want to get a broader brush. I think you can think of three macro phases. Let's call them that. The first would be from 78 to 89. Although that really spills over into 90 and 91. But, let's just take that first. The 80s, the long 1980s as the first phase. The second phase, from 92, from the Nanchun, from the Southern Tour, I would say all the way down to 2012. Okay, so a long phase. And then a third phase that begins in 2013 and brings us up to the present. Okay?
That's really interesting, Ken, because in both of the characterizations, there was a general consensus that they would split the pre-WTO era off from the not post, but in the WTO era. So it's interesting that you're including all of that within one phase.
Well, I think, yeah. When we get to joining the WTO, for me, that's not a turning point. That's part of what's going on in that whole era from 92 to 2012. That's a very important moment. I weirdly enough, I was in Beijing when Charlene Barshevsky, the American trade negotiator, was there at one point. And I happened to have a friend who I'd known, an American from the 1980s when she was studying in Beijing at the program that I was working with, who at that point was working at the American embassy. So I was hearing a lot about what was going on. And this would have been in 99. And the intensity of those negotiations and the game playing that the Americans were doing and things like that. There's no question that the decision to join the WTO was a big decision, but it's part of a process that is revived and reinvigorated with Deng Xiaoping in 92.
Yeah.
But that really carries on all the way down through the Hu Jintao era, right? Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So yeah, I don't see the WTO entry as demarcating different phases. That seems to me to be a central node in a broad phase that runs from 92 to 2012.
That's really interesting, Ken, and I'm sure that we'll get into that specific point when we talk about that phase. But since you're categorizing that first phase from 78 right up until 89 or maybe 92. Why don't, instead of cutting it off at price control, how I previously articulated the question, why don't you just take us through some of those major reforms that were taking place in that long 1980s as you were describing it?
Yeah. I mean, again, certainly we can take that period and break it down into maybe three phases. Again, it's just how fine grained you want to get, you could even demarcate a few other things within there. But basically, the reforms run along two tracks, and this goes back to the developments that went on in the first 30 years. And we want to be clear right at the beginning of talking about the reforms in a more concrete way, that the decisions that are made and the premise of what's going to happen was that, the first 30 years of building socialism had achieved significant success. The Chinese economy had grown somewhere around 3% a year on the average, for 30 years, which is significant growth. And people's livelihoods had been significantly improved. Housing, education, healthcare, transportation, communication, all kinds of things had been improved, had been enhanced. The lives of the Chinese people in 1979, let's say, 30 years after liberation, were dramatically better. Life expectancy had risen, tremendously. Infant mortality, which is often taken as a public health indicator, had dropped dramatically. The available food supply for people all through the country, urban and rural, had grown steadily, obviously with disruptions around the time of the Great Leap. But overall, that period it's not a period of failure, as bourgeois critics like to argue, but it was one which had achieved significant economic development. But that development had been matched in its pace by the population growth. The number of people simply grew and grew. And in fact, the successes in things like healthcare facilitated that. People were living longer, they were healthier, and they were having more, not more children than before, but the children they were having were surviving at a higher rate. So population growth goes on. China passes 1 billion people right at the beginning of the 1980s. So that in itself is a mark of success, but it also means that many of the gains that were made in productivity, in food supply and all this are absorbed. They're consumed by that growing population. So when we look at China in 1978-79, we're looking at a society which had achieved, as I've heard it characterized by a number of people, a kind of egalitarianism of poverty, right? Because people were not, going hungry. People were not unhoused. People were not, plagued by disease and malnutrition anymore. Those days were long gone. People had adequate food, housing, opportunities, all kinds of things. But the material standard of living was relatively modest, shall we say. And what the party leaders decide, what their feeling is that an egalitarianism of poverty is not socialism. Socialism is an egalitarianism of abundance, right? The idea is that you want to develop the economy. You want to reach a point where everyone has not just a basic sufficiency, but the ability to access a material life, have a material base for their lives, which allows them to fulfill themselves as individuals and as members of the collectivities of society, right? And so the goal of setting out on the path of reform is to develop the economy, to further increase the material base, the material quality of people's lives. And that moves in along a couple of tracks. One of which, very controversial, especially in the West, very contentious, although embraced by the masses of the people in the long run, was the one-child policies. The idea of slowing down population growth, right? Easing the pressure on the economy of this rapidly growing population. And, obviously this was a policy that had its contradictions. Again, it's a human thing. It's a human society, but very, very quickly it won widespread support and persisted down until very recently, I guess about 8 years ago. So that's one track. And we need to understand that without the one-child policies, much of the growth that China has achieved would either not have been possible or would have been straightforwardly eaten up by a much larger population. China could today have a population of 1.8 billion, maybe even 2 billion, rather than the 1.4 billion that it has, which is in a state now of easing, of declining a bit, not collapsing, but dropping slightly as we're going forward. And we can talk about that maybe towards the end a little more. But that's one thing that gets put in place. But the other and the more sort of classically economic dimension was this concept of using the mechanisms of the market to develop the productive economy. The idea being that, as Marx and Engels write about in the manifesto, as Lenin understood back in the new economic policies in the early 1920s in the Soviet Union, that to get an economy going, to get an economy growing, especially one that's directed towards addressing the needs of ordinary consumers, markets can play a positive function. Markets cannot be allowed to become the dominant thing. They can't become the driving force in the economy in the sense of just let's have it be wide open. Let's just let the markets do everything. But market mechanisms can be utilized to drive innovation, creativity, management efficiency, productivity, things like that. And so that's the underlying idea, is that we're going to use the methods of the market to develop the productive economy, but we're going to maintain, through the instrumentalities of the party and the state, we're going to maintain oversight, we're going to maintain the socialist core of the economy, and we will use the power of the state and the party and the people to constrain and contain the contradictions and, in some instances, the excesses which we understand will arise in the course of implementing these policies. So this is a very clear-eyed approach to development. It's not an idealist, let's just throw the place open to the market. It's not an abandonment of the revolution and the role of the party. If anything, it's a strengthening of the role of the party, because it puts the responsibility for, not going down the capitalist road right smack on the party itself. Right. So that's what's behind the specific policies that we can look at. And those proceed, again, along two tracks that we've seen in place for a long time: industrial development and agricultural development. In the agricultural sector, what we get is the implementation. There'd been down in Sichuan province, Deng Xiaoping's home province, where he still had a lot of influence. There'd been experiments with what was called the household responsibility system. And that is, in effect, a decollectivization of agricultural productivity. Although it's not just an abandonment of the socialist infrastructure, because there's still, township and county level collectivities, but productive activity on the land is now structured in a very different way. And essentially what happens is that individual households are now able to enter into contractual relationships with these, collective units, townships, counties, to produce a specified set quantity of particular agricultural products. This is primarily, of course, focused on grain. But this is a different mechanism for drawing grain into the central government, right? Grain is still used, it's still marketed internationally as a source of capital, as a source of money for development. Grain also has to come into the cities and be available for distribution. But now the mechanisms of doing that are state procurement, right, which is the contract that people enter into, but also parallel to state procurement, markets. And so people can, once they have met their contractual quota of procurement for the state at a set state price, they can sell whatever surplus they have in private markets, okay? And that, leads very quickly in the first few years, 81, 82, to an increase in agricultural production. That, however, plateaus pretty quickly. By 84, 85, you're not seeing those dramatic increases in agricultural production because you reach certain technological limitations. The amount of land, the amount of labor input, the availability of things like fertilizers and things like that. There are constraints, just natural physical constraints on agricultural productivity. But there is this first wave, and that's one of the ways in which, if we wanted to divide, sort of sub-periods, that would be a marker, that first wave of the expansion of agricultural productivity. It gets up, it stays much higher, it continues to increase, but not in the dramatic leaps that we get in say, 81 and 82. So that's on track. That's going on in the countryside, and that whole process will continue.
Although I will add one thing just on agriculture very quickly to tease listeners that in the relatively near future, we're going to have an entire episode on the issue of decollectivization of agriculture with Zhen Shu, who is a returning guest of the show as well. We're going to have him talk about his book, From Commune to Capitalism. But one of the things he points out in this book is that a lot of the productivity gains within agriculture in this period was a result of increasing usage of inputs like land and labor rather than the specific policies themselves. Like it was input driven rather than organization driven, if that makes sense. So it's worth keeping that in mind just as an addendum to what you were saying, not that invalidates what you were saying in any way.
Oh, no. I mean, it's exactly right that it is input driven. The difference being that I don't think you can separate out the role that the policies play in facilitating that new input structure, right?
Of course, yeah.
There's a dialectical relationship.
The inputs have to come from somewhere. The question is whether productivity is productivity because of organization solely, or whether the policy is including input into how it is going to increase output as a right. Productivity in that term. Sure. So I just wanted to help the listeners perhaps get that little taste of where that productivity in large part was coming from. And then again, just listeners, stay tuned because we're going to have an entire episode devoted to agricultural reform in this period. In the semi-near future. I'm talking with Shun right now anyway. So yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ken, feel free to carry on.
That's fine. On the industrial side, things get things are perhaps a little more complex. The goal is to develop the productive economy, right? So that involves foreign direct investment, what's called FDI, foreign direct investment, opening up China to capital inputs from the outside. And in order to incentivize that, of course, China has its attractions. It has an educated, competent labor force, which is available at relatively low cost, certainly on a global comparative basis. They pursue this in a couple of ways. One, of course, is the creation of the special economic zones, the SEZs. These were areas beginning down south, at Shenzhen and Zhuhai, but then proliferating along the coast and eventually spreading to other areas in the country. These were areas where foreign corporations could invest, build productive capacity, build factories, basically, and have special, not be subject to the domestic sort of revenue structures within the country. They could repatriate a proportion of profits, a significant proportion of profits, but not everything. And these had to be structured. These investments needed to be structured as joint ventures. That is to say, there needed to be a Chinese partner in many of these enterprises. But the attractiveness of China, on two sides. One, on the what I mentioned as the idea of this educated, sophisticated labor force that was available at globally relatively very low prices to begin with, but also the possibility of marketing a proportion of things that were produced. A lot of stuff, the idea was they were going to be produced for export, but there was also going to be the opportunity for marketing within the country, and that gets back to the old fantasy of Western capital, and the line that comes from the early 19th century: if every Chinaman would extend the length of his sleeve of his gown by an inch, the mills of Lancashire would spin forever. This vision. Karl Crowe, in the late 19th, early 20th century, wrote a book called 400 Million Customers, and this vision of China as a vast new arena for the pursuit of profit, was just irresistibly attractive to Western capital. And so Western capital starts to flow into the country. And through the 80s, there are a number of really tough structural questions about how reform can be implemented. We're going to have this new investment coming in. We're going to have these new productive facilities. We're going to have new commodities coming into the domestic markets. How do we manage that? How do we manage this growth? There's a wonderful book by a scholar at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And that's a really, really critical question, because as we look at what happens with the Soviet Union, once the collapse of the Soviet Union takes place and Western capital just flows in and in conjunction with the fire sale of social assets that leads to the emergence of the oligarchs in the Soviet Union, this is a problem that it doesn't get addressed for a while. The initial phase of post-communist life in Russia is one in which capital faces very little in terms of management and constraint, and that has some very negative consequences. We don't need to go too deep into that. I think most people are familiar with that phase of things. But in China, the goal is to manage this process in a more incremental way, and Isabella Weber's book looks at these debates within the party over how to go forward. There were distinctive positions. There were some who advocated for sort of all-out marketization, just let the markets do everything. There were others who really wanted to take a more cautious step-by-step approach in a variety of ways. There were debates. For example, one of the big decisions that gets made, although it has to be moderated and modified down the road, was to use the automobile industry as a driver for industrial development. This was based on the experience of the United States, where back in the 1920s, a coalition of government and industry leaders, capital leaders, decided to basically dismantle what had been a massive public transportation infrastructure, especially in the eastern part of the country, and instead direct public funds to building roadways, highways, and all this, so that the automobile industry could grow, so that people would have an easy way to drive their cars, all the way across the country. Think of the romantic images of, Route 66 and all that. That's the result of conscious developmental policies on the part of American capital and the American state, which is an instrument of administration of capital. The same kind of decision is made in China in the mid-'80s to invest a lot, to allow a lot of investment in the development of, the automobile industry and all the infrastructure that would go with that. Building highways, developing, a domestic, think of gas stations and restaurants and all this kind of stuff. And if you travel in China today, if you drive around in China today, you see that follows through, that is produced in abundance. But, of course, we know now that leads to negative consequences because automobiles produce a lot of pollution. Now they're trying to address that, by the whole development of electric vehicles and that, these things generate their own contradictions. It's a dialectical process. And as historical materialists, we understand, and they understood, that these processes would yield contradictions which weren't necessarily anticipated or understood right at the beginning. And this again is that phrase that I think I've mentioned before about crossing the river by feeling the rocks, that the reform program isn't a prefigured, guaranteed, just roll out the blueprints kind of thing. It's trying to build a socialist economy using these market mechanisms, and it's definitely a complex process going forward. But those debates take place, and one of the crucial things, which Henry's already referred to, is the question of price reform, right? To what extent are we going to let prices be set by the market, by market forces? Should there be price ceilings? Should there be price bases? What should be the range of market variation? How far can prices change? How rapidly can prices change? Which sectors can be deregulated first and which should be held until later? And there are very, very dynamic debates about this. They bring in consultants from Eastern Europe, where some of the socialist economies there had been struggling with similar questions. They bring in economists and industry specialists from the West. And, of course, they're all advocates of, just let it rip. But fortunately, for the most part, cooler heads prevailed, and the process went forward in a somewhat incremental way until we get down to 1987 or so, when forces largely centered around the figures of Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang sort of throw their support more to a more rapid price deregulation. And there's 87, there's an attempt at that only lasts about 6 weeks and gets rolled back because it causes inflation and runs on commodities and things. But after what they think of as some appropriate fine-tuning, they try it again in 1988 on a very large scale. And that triggers real serious economic problems, especially in the urban sectors, that lead very quickly into the contradictions and the unrest that breaks out in April of 1989. And I suppose that perhaps this is a time where we want to go ahead and move and talk about that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a perfect segue because, obviously here in the West, if you know anything about China, it's almost always that image of the man standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square and how the West made lots of hay out of this. And they still do to label China as this authoritarian, tyrannical regime. I mean, to say nothing of the hypocrisy of that for Western governments. But that's a side point, and all the listeners will intuitively understand that. But I'm interested in the event itself. This is 89 is the year that I was born, so it's kind of interesting, and it's also the end of this sort of first phase that you've laid out for us in this 3-phase approach. You said it could technically kind of go towards 91 and 92, but 89 is an interesting stopping point for phase 1. So with all that in mind, can you tell us about the event and, importantly, how these conditions that you're talking about, these underlying conditions and this new economic issues arising from the deregulation of certain things, how that might play in to this event and the government's response?
Yeah, the only way to really make sense of what happens in 89 is to understand the contradictions that emerged in the course of the 80s. And, and again, the leadership, I believe, and all the indications, things I've read suggest, and people that I've talked with there, talk about, the leadership understood that using markets was a dangerous thing, and that it was going to lead to the emergence of contradictions. Contradictions like corruption, that opening things up to market forces, it creates opportunities for people in positions of power in the party or in the state to abuse their positions, their powers. Instead of seeing them as a public trust, instead of understanding their objective as serving the people, some people were going to take advantage of that to enrich themselves. They were going to manipulate the situation to their own advantage. And that was understood, but the idea was that, you'd have to take measures to try to keep that under control. But that becomes a problem. You didn't have a lot of corruption, in the first 30 years. It was just a completely different kind of system, of structure. But now you have those opportunities, and some people did begin to abuse that power. So contradictions of corruption begin to emerge in the 80s, and people see that. There were also, differential levels of improvement, of development. Some sectors advanced more quickly than others. Some people were feeling left behind. In particular, a lot of people that we might think of as the professionals, and especially young people who were at the beginning or even not even yet at the beginning of their careers, they were still students, thinking about what the future held for them. People who were in what we would think of as kind of public sector jobs, not public sector productive jobs like factories, but public sector jobs like education or medicine or the legal professions, journalism, other kinds of things like that. Their livelihoods were not being improved as rapidly, kind of ironically in some ways, as those of farmers in the countryside or a lot of industrial workers. Certainly in industry there was some pain being inflicted in terms of reform of enterprise operation, but wages were rising and productivity was improving, and all that. But there were differential effects of this. And some people, especially educated young people in the cities, apparently felt a certain level of anxiety and frustration that they were not being taken into account, or at least that they didn't have what they felt was a sufficient seat at the table, Many people viewed Hu Yaobang in particular, who had been leader of the Young Communist League and had a lot of he had a lot of profile among young people. He dies on April 15th in 1989, right in the middle of a meeting of the leadership. He had been moved out of his top leadership position in 1988 because it was felt that the reforms that he was advocating were a little too fast, a little too unregulated, a little too reckless, basically. But he didn't lose his position in the leadership. He stepped down from his top position, but he was still a part of the political bureau. And it's in a meeting of the political bureau. He has a heart attack, and dies. That leads to some demonstrations by students, again, sort of echoing back to 1976 and the April 5th, the Qingming demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. And there's perhaps some miscalculations on the part of the leadership. The leadership, again, is a complex mix of people. We don't want to think of it as this authoritarian monolith. It's a political complex. And some elements in the leadership right away characterize even these protests, these marches, as anti-party, right? Many of the students thought of themselves initially as just patriotic, but, contradictions begin to emerge. Then, this occupation of Tiananmen Square gets underway, and people are camping out and hanging out down in the square. And, the state takes a very hands-off policy. They let people camp out in the square. Imagine if people, tried to pull that by occupying, that park right across from the White House in Washington. They're swept out of there, by the cops overnight, right? Not in Beijing. These young people had something to say. There were different responses to what they were saying, but that was tolerated. But then, at the end of April, beginning of May, Gorbachev makes a visit to Beijing. He's coming around. This had been a big deal. The Chinese were very proud of what they had accomplished in the reform era. And here's, Gorbachev, this sort of reformist leader in the Soviet Union. They wanted to show off their accomplishments. And this visit had been planned for a long time. Instead, Gorbachev arrives. They bring him in from the airport. They can't even take him in the front steps of the Great Hall of the People. They got to sneak him in a side door. It's very, very embarrassing. It's a real humiliation for the leadership, the Chinese leadership, with Gorbachev's visit. And to make matters worse, of course, the Western media have flocked to Beijing to cover Gorbachev's visit, which they thought was going to be this, sort of triumphalist occasion. But now, they're just delighted that it's an embarrassment for the leadership of the PRC. And they start, calling the demonstrators, the protesters, they start emphasizing the idea that what they want is to overthrow the Communist Party, to overthrow the government of the People's Republic, and to have a color revolution. They didn't call them that quite yet, but to have this kind of regime change take place, which was not at all what people were saying at first. But then within the student movement, within this protest movement, new elements begin to emerge and take over the leadership. People like Chai Ling and Wang Dan and Wu Kai-shi, right? And I got to know Wu Kai-shi because later on he was at Harvard when I was in grad school there. And this was not a fellow who had a profound grasp of politics and certainly knew nothing about democracy. Just a little side anecdote. He was, when he came to Harvard, he was assigned a tutor to help him, work on his public sort of presentations because they thought he was going to be some great asset, for the government program at Harvard. But he kept not showing up for his classes, and finally, his sort of overall handler confronted him and said, what are you doing? You're supposed to be going to these tutorials so you can talk about your democracy movement. And he says in Chinese, he says, "Minjua,太麻烦," which means democracy. It's such a hassle, He just didn't have any understanding of what real workers' democracy would be like, right? So this idea that the demonstrators were calling for democracy and for overthrowing the government and all this, that becomes what's going on, but that's a manipulated outcome. These particular elements that came to be predominant, not necessarily among the actual people in the square even, but in the media, in what was being said, and there they are holding up their signs in English, right? They're building this bogus, so-called Statue of Liberty thing, evoking, Western imperialist core, right? So, these contradictions deepened. The leadership, the party, invited these leaders to come to the Great Hall, come into the Great Hall and meet. Deng Xiaoping, Li Peng, other leaders of the party meet with the leaders. Wu Kai-shi shows up wearing pajamas, right? He'd been in the hospital and that's okay. But he just comes over wearing his pajamas. I mean, the whole thing kind of spins out of control in this bizarre theater. And, efforts to communicate, efforts to find a negotiating position just founder because these more intransigent leaders, Chai Ling at one point says publicly that they want a bloody confrontation because that's the only way to provoke the kind of revolution that's going to sweep away, the communist leadership. So, the idea that somehow, these were innocent students who were just sort of protesting and then the evil communists, come in and crush them. That's just such a concocted narrative, right? What happens, of course, we get to June. The city has been paralyzed. This is the capital of the country. It's been paralyzed for over a month. And the leaders decide that can't go on, that they have to clear the streets. And they bring in elements of the People's Liberation Army. They come into the city from particularly from the west side, but also from the east side along Chang'anjie, the main east-west street. And by this time, there are elements that want to pursue this overthrow of the system that come out and fight. They stop some of the vehicles, they kill soldiers, they steal weapons and start killing more soldiers. In the course of the night, the people that I know, and I was there, I wasn't there June 4th, but I was there by the beginning of July. And people I talked to who'd been involved in the protests, people I talked to who worked at the Naval Hospital, which was the closest one to where the main fighting took place, because it was right across the street from the school that I was at back in the 80s, told me, that their best estimate was that in the course of all that, somewhere between 600 and 800 people had been killed, and that of that, almost 300 had been military personnel. So this was a very, very violent confrontation. So it was not just, soldiers rolling in and massacring students. That's not at all what happened. This was a violent uprising in the end that contested for the overthrow of the system. No one was killed in Tiananmen Square. That whole mythology has been largely debunked by a number of sources. And really, if you go back and you read the immediate press coverage at the time by reporters who were there, they say the same thing. That's what they saw. But that gets mythologized, and as Brett said, that image of the dude with the shopping bags and the tank, that's just everybody's icon. But in fact, of course, he doesn't even get arrested, right? He stands there, he stops the tank, he does his little dance thing, and then he goes on his way. You don't see that. That's never shown. We just get this idea of the tank and the heroic, individual standing up to power. But that's not even an accurate representation of what's shown in the video from which that still is taken. So, I don't think anyone feels great about what happened June 4th in Beijing. The party leadership did what they came to believe had to be done to clear the streets, to get the city functioning again, to get the government able to function again. That produces, of course, widespread international condemnation. The same bourgeois media that had been fanning the flames, had been gleefully anticipating overthrowing the government, now, of course, become a chorus of condemnation. And it was very difficult in those times to try to speak out in any way that tried to take a more calm and rational approach to understanding what had happened. There's just this chorus of condemnation. People, study programs, economic activity, there's a great downturn. I was there, as I say, in July of 89, because I was still working, even while I was in grad school, I was still working with this organization that ran programs. And there were a dozen or so students who still, heroically, I think, went to Beijing that summer to study. Let's keep those exchanges, those things, those connections open. That was our view. But there was a lot of condemnation, a lot of boycotts and turning away. Travel groups, tourism, that just went down the toilet for a while. But even this sort of wave of bogus hand-wringing and moral condemnation, that fades, because the overwhelming material realities of the modern world, the attractions of China, once again, the attractions of China for capital were irresistible. So late 89, 90, 91 even, China's trying to recover from this. China's trying to reposition itself. But again, there's debates within the party leadership about, well, what do we do now? We had these contradictions that emerged in the 80s. We had this unrest that turned into a counter-revolutionary uprising. What are we going to do? Some people were like, we got to shut this down. We got to stop these reforms. We got to, go back to a much more, a structured, planned economy. Not just the core, but the whole thing. Wipe this stuff out. Others, took the position of, the problem is we didn't go far enough. We didn't open it up enough to the free market, da-da-da. And Deng Xiaoping then, once again, emerges as the voice of what we can think of as kind of the mainstream reform position. And that leads to his Southern tour in 1992, where he kind of paraphrases Mao back when he said, communes are good. Now, Deng Xiaoping down in Shenzhen says, reform is good. We're going to get reform back on track. We're going to move forward. We're going to deepen it, broaden it, strengthen it, and move forward. So that's the turning point between that first phase. I think that first phase has to include 89 and its aftermath as part of that whole, sort of long 1980s. But 92 is clearly the change to that second, for me, long phase that's going to run for the next 20 years.
Well, Ken, that feeds right into my question, and you already started to answer it. And I know that we only have about 15 minutes or so left with you, so I'll try to keep this brief because we still have two phases to talk about. But as you were starting to answer, the Southern Tour in 92 really was the changing point. And then that second phase then goes on for about 20 years. So just to be brief, can you tell us a little bit about how the Southern Tour emerges from that post-Tiananmen atmosphere and how that then transforms into the second phase, which then carries out for 20 years? What are some of the high points, just briefly? Otherwise, we won't have a chance to hit the third phase.
Sure. And we can extend a little bit. As I say, I got a little wiggle room. So, the Southern Tour, which so interestingly, the term they use for that, the Chinese term they use for it, the Nanshun, is a term that refers back to the Qing dynasty when both the Kangxi and the Qianlong emperors did what they called inspection tours to go down to southern China to look at how things were going. And this was a phase, the late 17th, 18th centuries, where China was once again booming, where its, sort of commercial capitalist economy had rebounded from the turmoil of the mid-17th century. So the Nanshun, the Southern Tour, had this sort of evocation of a moment of transition where things were going to get, things were going to be better, things were going to improve, and that the leadership was checking it out to make sure that we were on track. They were on track. So, that's the result, as I say, of these debates within the party after 89 about how to go forward, changes in leadership. Zhao Ziyang is out as prime minister. He was seen as again, pursuing lines of reform that were just too excessive. Jiang Zemin is brought in, and he's a sort of consummate technocrat. And after the course of debates, because it's a democratic centralist party, they reach the conclusion that we're gonna reinvigorate reform along certain lines, and so the Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour is the public event that communicates that commitment, that reinvigoration of reform. But this second long phase needs to be understood in a very particular context or a very particular way. And this is why I don't see the WTO membership as a rupture point, but as a step along this long path. Because this is the phase, this is the period, of course, where China's economy really takes off. You have, 10, 11, 12, even 13% annual growth rates through this long period, over, well over a decade. Capital is flowing in, technology is coming in. China is increasingly drawing on the global capitalist system to develop its economy, and that economy is developing very, very rapidly. That takes place. China needs to accommodate itself to that global capitalist system. And Deng Xiaoping, maybe the last of his important messages, was he urges other leaders, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, others, who are going to follow after him, to bide their time and build their capabilities, right? And what that meant was we're gonna do this. We're gonna pursue this course of development. We're gonna build our economy. We're gonna maintain our socialist core up to the point where we can reach a point where we can begin to implement socialist distribution. For now, we're using market mechanisms. Frankly, those are mechanisms for the extraction of surplus. Workers are working in the factories. They're working in various kinds of productive activities, construction workers, all this. They're being paid wages, and those wages are not the same as socialist distribution. They're not getting, some sort of absolutely equitable distribution of the value that they're producing. There's a process of accumulation going on, some of which is in private hands, profitability to private capital and foreign capital, but a lot of which is accumulation of social wealth in the hands of the state, right? So the socialist state. So we recognize that. And we recognize that to build the economy, we have to go through this. And we need foreign capital, and we need foreign technology, and we need foreign expertise. So we're gonna not shove socialism in the face of the global system. We're gonna take a low profile, bide our time, build our capabilities. Joining the WTO is a perfect example of that, because it brings China into this global capitalist nexus in ways that allow it to, be more attractive, have better, conditions for the access to foreign technology and capital. And the economy grows and grows and grows. People's livelihoods improve. The availability of housing, the per capita square feet available for people just grows and grows and grows. Educational opportunities, the number of people able to go to college. Now in China, almost half of people graduating from high school can go to university. When I was there in the early 80s, that was maybe 10, 12%, So that's a remarkable expansion of educational opportunity. Improvements in healthcare, all these kinds of things are going on. But China is keeping its head down. China is going along with global capital. And what this does, one of the things it does, is it kind of feeds the wishful thinking, the illusions of Western capital, of Western imperialism, of basically the United States. 1989 didn't work out for them. They had hoped that the communist government would fall and something much more sympathetic to global capital would replace it, and capital would have kind of free rein to restructure China in the same way that they were busily going about trying to restructure Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, places like that. But instead, China, survived 1989 and reinvigorated the reform period. But Western imperialism still hoped, still dreamed that, as you often heard them say, economic liberalization inevitably leads to political liberalization. And when they say liberalization, what they mean, of course, is the power of capital, right? So they continued to nurture that fantasy. Joining the WTO, that seemed like, okay, they're playing along. They're coming to join us. But what China was really doing was taking advantage of the global capitalist system to develop itself, to develop its economy. It was doing exactly what they said. And if you read what they talked about, in the domestic press and everything, which of course is often dismissed as just propaganda in the West, they're always very clear that the goal is to build a socialist future. The goal is to build a level of material prosperity that would allow for socialist distribution to move finally towards that egalitarianism of abundance that was the overarching objective of reform, to build the economy to that point. Okay. So that goes on. And there's bumps along the way. There's the 97 financial crisis around Asia. China weathers that remarkably well. They had accumulated tremendous foreign exchange reserves, dollar reserves, which they were able to pump in, for example, to Hong Kong to keep the Hong Kong dollar from falling in the way that, the Thai baht or the Indonesian ringgit had collapsed as market, speculators, money market speculators had messed around. Foreign exchange, China had the muscle to tough it out through the 97 crisis. But when we get down to 2008, things get interesting. Because that's the point at which, we have this global financial crisis. These ridiculous derivatives and bogus mortgage packages in the United States lead to a massive financial meltdown, 2007, 2008, which then infects the rest of the global capitalist system and causes tremendous hardship. People lose their homes, people lose their savings. We see it as the worst capitalist crisis probably since the global depression back in the 1930s. It affects China, not in the financial sector, because China has always kept its financial sector walled off from global speculators, but in the productive sector, because consumer demand in the West, especially in the United States, largely evaporates. And corporations like Walmart, that are huge exporters out of China into the United States, they're not buying stuff. Other companies as well. They're not, consumer demand is not there. 20 million people, maybe even a little more, are laid off by factories in China. 20 million people lose their jobs. But it's at that point that we can see how the socialist core in China, how the socialist system in China makes it so different from the capitalist West. Because those 20 million people, yes, they lose their jobs, but you know what? They have household registrations. They have what's called a hukou, and they can go home to the villages from which they had come, where they are guaranteed housing, they're guaranteed health care, they're guaranteed education for their children, and they have access to other economic resources. They're not living the life of luxury. They're not, going back and just, even living the material quality of life probably that they had in their, where they were working. But they're not cast out on the streets. They're not living in refrigerator boxes, on the sidewalk. They're not putting up tent cities because they have nowhere to go and no one to help them. The socialist core is there and they're taken care of. And observers in the West see this, and they hear how China talks about what it's doing, that socialism is taking care of people. And I think this begins to undermine the sort of rosy view of the future that Western capital had, that China was going to somehow, at some point, go through what by now they call the color revolution and become a subordinate component of the global capitalist system. That leads in the West in 2011 to Obama and Hillary Clinton announcing the pivot to Asia and calling for a new American Pacific century. They're now seeing China not as a potential future component of the capitalist system, but somehow as some sort of rogue country that isn't getting with the program. And it's in that context that this second phase, this long phase of building the economy, accommodating China to Western capitalism, biding time, keeping a low profile, but building capability, building the economy, creating vast improvements in the material quality of life and conditions in China, accumulating social wealth, in the hands of the government. Now they reach a point where they can move to the next phase, which now they start to talk about as the primary phase of socialism. And that is marked by the election of Xi Jinping, right? Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang at that point are elected in 2012 as the new leaders. They take office in 2013. And that begins sort of the third macro phase, which we are in today, right? And now it's 13 or 11 years down the road, we're still in that phase. And that's a phase where China no longer has to totally accommodate itself to Western capitalism, to the global capitalist system. China, by this time, has achieved a level of material abundance, not the end goal, but they're starting to achieve what they call a moderately prosperous society, right? Where, by 2019, they complete the project of lifting 800 million people out of poverty. They eliminate the final pockets of absolute poverty by United Nations standards, right? And of course, they continue. It's not like, oh, we did that, we're done with that. They're continuing to redistribute social wealth that has been accumulated by the process of surplus extraction. There's no question that's how this is done. But they have social wealth that can be redistributed into poverty eradication, into programs to deal with environmental issues. They understood, and they got a clearer and clearer understanding that along with corruption and inequality, that environmental contradictions were also going to emerge from the use of markets. But now they're redirecting socially accumulated wealth to address those things, to invest in alternative energy, to invest in research and development for addressing climate change, global warming, things like that. China is probably the leading country, certainly the leading developed country, in terms of its activities, in terms of its contributions to trying to address global warming, whether it's alternative energy production, solar panels, electric vehicles. We could go through a whole panoply of ways in which China is playing that role. And finally, the last point I want to make on this theme is that when we get to the pandemic, we get to COVID-19, once again, we see how China's socialist system handles this in a way that's completely different from the West, where it's seen as a profit opportunity, right? In China, the party, the state, the people mobilize to contain the virus, to contain the pandemic. Again, of course, the West condemns this. Oh, look, it's authoritarianism, lockdown is all we heard in the West. But the realities in China, again, certainly in a human society with contradictions, with mistakes, with problems along the way. There's no, we're not trying to say everything went perfectly, but they did a lot of things right, and they kept their death count down. They saved lives. They made human life, saving human lives, the priority, not generating profits for insurance companies, hospital corporations, pharmaceuticals, super profits for all those sectors in the West. While the United States has lost, 1.1 million people now. In China, until they relaxed the policies, a year and a half ago, not quite, 14, 15 months ago, they had fewer than 5,000 deaths. And even, there's a wave of mortality that emerges after the relaxation of the policies. They're still under 60,000, right? So a small fraction of deaths in the West in a population 4 times bigger than that of the United States. So, the United States can rant all at once about what a great healthcare system it has and how, China's such a terrible authoritarian place. But the reality is that China saved the lives of perhaps 3 or 4 million people, while the United States just cast human life down the toilet so long as profits were being made for corporations. And that contrast, that demarcates the way in which China remains on the path of socialist development. Are they there? Have they achieved full socialism? No. There's still workers in factories who are not receiving the full wealth, the full value of the labor that they are expending, of the wealth that they are producing. We understand that. That's what market mechanisms mean. And, we want to get past that. They want to get past that. The goal is socialism. And then eventually, and this is going to take a long time, communism, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. That's the goal. That's the dream. Xi Jinping talks about staying true to the original mission of the revolution. That's what he's talking about. They're on that path. Will they succeed? I certainly hope so. And I believe so. But I also know history, there's no done deals. So we watch it, we support it, we encourage it, we oppose imperialist efforts to derail China's development, to contain China, maybe to destroy China. We oppose those, but we do so, recognizing that we support China in a what I like to call, we extend critical support. There are contradictions that we don't approve of. There are things that, different of us will have different opinions about. But overall, we think that the path of socialist development is worth support, and that's kind of where we're at.
An absolute masterclass. The rhetoric veered into inspiring at times, and I genuinely agree with everything you said, and I've never heard as good of a breakdown of that period as you just gave. A way to end this episode, and I know you've certainly touched on it, and we could end right there because you had a wonderful sort of closing statement. But looking to the future, one thing that I see a lot, especially in the West, and this is no surprise to anybody who's been listening to this conversation or knows anything about this topic, there's constant predictions of China's collapse. One of the figures that have risen up lately, I've read every one of his books because I'm a masochist, is Peter Zeihan. And he is convinced that the demographic crisis in China is such that China is going to collapse in any day now. I'm checking my watch. Any day now, it's going down. So I'm interested in your thoughts on the near-term future of China, how Xi Jinping sees himself and his leadership of the Communist Party in light of everything we've learned about Deng and Mao and the party itself. And then this idea of socialism by 2050 and what the near-term and medium-term goals are for the Communist Party of China on their path towards socialism. And as you said, eventually over the long-term communism.
Yeah. Boy, I mean, we could do a whole another hour on that. But given the constraints that we have to work with, China's positioned at an interesting moment. And I think that it's actually a very interesting moment because we have this demographic situation where China's population has started to become smaller, not at any kind of rapid pace, but it's not growing. And that sort of arc of development of growth of the population it's starting to turn down. And of course there's in certain circles, there's just panic about this, including some in China. Oh my God, what's going to happen? So few workers to support an older population. Well, at the same time, Xi Jinping and others in China have just in the last few weeks started talking, using a phrase of new productive forces, right? You're gonna if you're following Chinese media at all, you're going to be hearing this more and more. I just printed out a translation of some talk about this that's come out in the last couple of days. I'm really fascinated with this. And basically, I think going forward for China to achieve their goals, what they're going to do, this is, again, a situation in which it's the socialist nature of the system that's going to be critical. Because technological innovation, what we sometimes call automation or cybernetics, you hear various terms for it. Basically, the enhancement of the fixed capital component of production, right? The accumulated capital in technology. First it was in machinery, now it's in, high-tech systems and things like that. As opposed to the living, proportion of capital, the labor input, human labor input, active human labor input. The organic dimension, I suppose you might call it, is declining, right? In the West, that produces a crisis in the economy because, you need fewer workers. So more and more people get laid off from their jobs. But then they're not earning an income. So how can they buy the products that are coming out of the factories, right? For a capitalist economy, that's a very, very difficult contradiction to address because you don't want to pay people who aren't working because if they're not working, you're not extracting value from their labor, right? So we're not going to pay them, right? But on the other hand, if people aren't being paid, if people don't have jobs, how are they going to be consumers? So that's a fundamental structural problem for a capitalist economy. That's why we have to have socialism, because in socialism, you have this social accumulation of wealth, right? And then social distribution of wealth. And this idea of new productive forces, I think what they're talking about and where they're going with this is the idea that as the economy becomes more productive, as essentially we can call it capital, becomes more productive, the need for labor is going to be less and less. So having fewer workers, younger workers, doesn't have to be a problem, right? In fact, with growing efficiency of productivity, with growing technological inputs in productivity, fewer people can continue to produce greater value. And with a socialist system, that value can be distributed to everybody, right? To everybody. It can still be based upon your input. Socialism is from each according to their ability, to each according to their work. It can still be based upon that. But the quantity of work necessary to produce X amount of value, is going to be less. So the distribution can still be, one of abundance. So I think going forward that's the direction that China needs to be working to achieve. And this discussion, this rhetoric of new productive forces, I think is articulating that. It's just beginning to emerge, and we got to keep an eye on it. But I think that when we look at what China's doing in terms of its research and development, its investment structures, its emphasis on building an ecological civilization, which again focuses on reducing resource consumption, making production more efficient in those ways as well. I think that they're onto a number of good paths, a number of good tracks. The U.S., of course, is doing everything it possibly can to derail that, sanctions and embargoes and technological boycotts, and, of course, trying to force China to divert investment from enhancing productivity into military things, a new arms race, which they're certainly not buying. Their expenditures on military things are still a tiny fraction of those of the United States. But I do think that going forward, those are the directions in which I think China is going to be developing, over the next few decades. Having said that, I, of course, also have to trot out the classic caveat that I am a historian. I work on the past. And one thing that we learn is that predicting the future is really always a challenge. We don't learn from the past in the sense of we can turn it around and just project it into the future. But I do think that we can see trends and patterns, and we can see goals and objectives that the Chinese have articulated for themselves, and movement in those directions, which suggests to me that a more sophisticated, a more productive economy going forward is already being utilized to address social needs through the accumulation of social wealth, and that process can be, should be, and hopefully will be advanced by the party, by the state, by the people as we move deeper into the 21st century.
Yeah, a great note to end on. Just had to throw out that when Brett was referencing the coming collapse of China, the first thing that came into my mind, of course, was Gordon Chang, who has been revising his predictions for when that collapse would happen pretty much every other year for the last, 15 years at this point. But, who knows? Eventually he might be right in a couple hundred years or so. You never know. That's about at the rate that we would expect Gordon Chang to be right on anything at. But Ken, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on for this mini-series. I know that I mentioned in the previous episode that, if we knew it was going to be this fun, we would have just told you, Ken, it's going to be a 10-part mini-series that you're joining us for. But we will stick to saying that this is a 4-part mini-series for now. We'll bring you back when your new books are coming out. And, It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you about modern Chinese history over this past 5 to 6 hours of conversation that we've had in these 4 episodes. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I truly appreciate you coming and spending so much time with us and laying things out as clearly and comprehensively as you did. So again, our guest was Ken Hammond. This was part 4 of our series on modern Chinese history. Ken Hammond, professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University, author of China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. Ken, can you let the listeners know where they can find your book?
Sure. The book is published by 1804 Books in New York, and it's available at their website at 1804books.com. And we're also working with them, as Henry just alluded to, on a new book called China and the World, 1949 to 2024, looking at China's international relations and the ways in which those have been both rather consistent in some ways, but also have varied in different historical moments. We're hoping to have that out in time for the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic this October. But stay tuned and we'll let you know.
Yeah, definitely keep us in the loop, Ken. And when that's ready, we'll bring you back on. Brett, how can the listeners find your excellent podcast? And again, thanks for guest hosting this series. It's been a great pleasure having you here for all 4 parts of it.
It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Ken. And I would love to come back and co-host for that next episode you do about his new book, because I really would love talking to him and love learning from him. As for me, you can find everything I do at revolutionaryleftradio.com. Thank you, Henry.
Of course. My usual co-host Adnan Hussein has been unable to join us for this series as a result of some health things, but he's getting over them. You definitely should follow him on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein, Husain. Subscribe to his other podcast, The Majlis, which is focused on the Arab world and Muslim diaspora issues. That's MAJLIS, wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. You can help support the show, allow us to continue making episodes like this at patreon.com/Guerrilla History. That's GUERRILLA History. And you can follow us on Twitter to keep up to date with everything that we're putting out individually and collectively at Guerrilla_pod. Again, Guerrilla is spelled GUERRILLA_pod. And until next time, listeners, solidarity.